Folks who are logging in, we're going to get started here. Welcome to the basements of the Bowler College of Business. We're in a classroom here called the Fishbowl because there's glass on all sides and you can see through it. But welcome to our next installment of the Alumni Continuing Education series. My name is Rory O'Neill. I'm the Alumni Director here at John Carroll University. We're so happy so many of you are logging on to join us this evening. The Alumni Continuing Education Series, also called A.C.E.S, has been around since 2013, and it was created because John Carroll alumni are lifelong learners. They have a zest for learning well after they graduate, and they want to stay connected to their university and their alma mater. So we're so happy you're joining us. For those of you who have not joined or one of these programs before, or really engaged with the university in many years, there's a lot to be proud of, and there's a lot happening here at John Carroll University. If you were to walk from one end of the campus to the other, you would see a sign of all the progress and all the momentum happening here at John Carroll. If you were walking through the Dolan Science Center, you would see the new Nader Family Nursing Simulation Labs. If you were to walk through the Hamlin Quad, you would see the Gracilli Library under a 2-year construction project that'll dramatically reimagine our campus library. You would walk by Dolan Hall and Bocelli residence halls, totally gutted and renovated for incoming sophomores and juniors. And then if you were to walk through the atrium of the DJ Lombardo Student Center, you would see a transformed space for students to hang out and gather. And then if you were to ever park on the Belvoir parking lot, well, it's not there anymore. It is now a massive construction site, and coming from the ground is the new Athletic Wellness and Event Center, which will be one of the best recreation projects we've had here at John Carroll in quite some time. So there is a lot happening physically here on campus. On the academic front, we just launched our new College of Health, which is budgeted and supported by the nursing program and exercise science and really robust programs in pre-health and counseling. We also have amazing new programs in engineering physics. And, you know, the core of what makes John Carroll special is the Jesuit liberal arts tradition we have here. And that's kind of why we're here tonight. If you were to read your most recent issue of Onward, the alumni magazine, on page 18, you would see a wonderful article about interreligious understanding here at John Carroll. John Carroll for years has invested in amazing scholars and amazing faculty who specialize in certain religious traditions and provide an amazing theological and religious studies education for our students. We're here tonight because we have some amazing faculty who are amazing at providing amazing discourse and amazing dialogue during difficult times. There have been some awful things that have happened since October in the Middle East. And you may have seen on your evening news some amazing things happening at American colleges and universities on this topic. But here on campus, as you'll read in the Onward magazine, some amazing conversations have been happening. And it's because of the amazing investments we've made in the Theology and Religious Studies Department and the TUI Center for Interreligious Understanding. It's just been an amazing asset here at John Carroll for decades. So we've got an amazing program tonight. And the reason we're doing it is, you know, in the Catholic Church, we just celebrated the conclusion of Lent with Easter. In the Muslim tradition, Ramadan just ended just yesterday, and Passover is on the horizon for the Jewish community. All three of these religions' holiest of times are kind of coinciding in a similar time as they do from some years. So celebrating and honoring these sacred traditions can be difficult during difficult times. Well, to help us kind of navigate that conversation in those difficult times here, we've got an amazing panel and an amazing facilitator to have a great conversation on that topic. So I want to welcome in Dr. Semiha Topal, who's the program manager from the TUI Center for Interreligious Understanding. She's going to be our facilitator this evening. She comes to us from William & Mary and has been an amazing and excellent researcher and professor of religious studies for over 10 years. We're so happy to have her here tonight. She's an amazing part of the John Carroll community. Dr. Ed Hahnenberg is the Jack and Mary Jane Breen Chair in Systematic Theology, and is the chair of the Theology and Religious Studies Department at John Carroll. This past year, he was awarded the Colicchio Award for Teaching Excellence at John Carroll, and he's been an amazing faculty member since 2011. Dr. Zeki Saritoprak is the Sayed Nursi Chair in Islamic Studies, and he's an Associate Theology Professor here at John Carroll. Zeki, you are finishing up your 23rd year at John Carroll? 23rd year at John Carroll, and he was the inaugural chair. Yeah, there you go. The inaugural chair in Islamic Studies in 2003. And finishing off our panel is Dr. Noah Bickart, who's the inaugural Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Chair in Jewish Studies at John Carroll. This is a position that was created just in 2022 through very generous philanthropic support from Dr. Norma Geller, from Norma Geller from the class of '87, from the Milton and Tamara Maltz Foundation and the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Foundation, and he's been here since 2018. It's an amazing panel for an amazing discussion, and I'm going to turn it off to Semiha to keep us going. Thank you, Semiha.
Thank you, Rory, and I'm really excited to be facilitating this conversation at the Executive Committee of the TUI Center for Interreligious Understanding, and also 3 chairs of the endowed chairs of the TRS department, Theology and Religious Studies department. And Rory has already given like the great introduction, so I will directly start the conversation. And as he also mentioned, we are going through a time that kind of brings together many sacred times together, as well as like the total eclipse that we have just witnessed here in Cleveland today, on Monday, which also can be considered a sacred time from other perspectives too. So we just thought like, this is a great time to talk about time. And as we are kind of going through this end of Ramadan, the Eid al-Fitr, like, and to our Muslim, friends who are watching us, Eid Mubarak, we say. And then like the Passover is coming next week, like 22, between 30. And then we also have the Orthodox Easter on May 5th. So the Easter is also not over, like, in the world. So we are passing through this sacred time. And can you describe us how time and sacred time are seen in the religious traditions that you are studying and specializing in? We will start with Noah because of the chronological order.
The first. Yeah, I mean, I think that Passover is actually really instructive when thinking about Jewish time. I'm fond of saying that Jewish time is both a line and a circle sort of simultaneously. Certainly Passover in some ways represents a kind of memory of a point in history, the historical or mythic or pseudo-historical exodus from Egypt, which in many ways is the sort of foundation of Jewish national identity, the point in which Jews see themselves as coalescing into a political group and eventually coming to some sort of political relationship with God. Everything relates to the Exodus. And certainly biblical texts, both in the book of Exodus and outside of the book of Exodus, think about Passover in this historical sense. But on the other hand, Passover is frequently articulated, especially in biblical legal texts, as essentially an agricultural holiday. And so this eating of matzah, the unleavened bread, which has a part of the story of the Exodus in that the Jews in Egypt didn't have time to allow their bread to rise, so they took their dough with them and cooked it into these unleavened cakes. On the other hand, the legal texts in the Bible seem to suggest that unleavened bread is something that you make at the beginning of the grain harvest. And in the land of Israel, this is when Passover happens. And so simultaneously, it's a historical event and a cyclical event. And so I think Passover is a good model of this notion of time working in multiple ways at the same time.
And maybe briefly about the calendar, Gabriel calendar.
Sure, Passover also occurs in what the Bible calls the first month. Jewish time is really on a lunar calendar, not unlike the calendar in Islam. But of course, the book of Deuteronomy says that because Passover must happen in the month of Aviv, in the month in which the spring grain happens, you can't have a purely lunar calendar because that would be a 356-day calendar. You'd be a little bit short of the solar year every year. And so the whole Jewish calendar is structured in such a way that what is essentially a lunar calendar is, through a series of leap months, which are inserted every once in a while, able to sync a lunar calendar with the solar calendar, such that Passover always happens the same time in the solar year.
Mm-hmm. And do you mind if I,
Yeah.
Because really as we know, we've talked about this, I feel like every year, the Christian calendar has a similar effort to sync, right, the moon and the sun, which aren't quite exact. And And every Easter, Christians know that is different. It doesn't have a set date, like Christmas is always on December 25th. And I somewhere early on in my Catholic school education learned that it's always on the first Sunday after the first full moon, after the vernal equinox, right? And later on in school, I learned that was thanks to the Council of Nicaea, which decided on a set date for Easter. So it is in many ways calculated in much the same way that Passover is. And I think Christians have a similar, another thing I learned in Catholic school was that time is a line.
Right.
We were making those in elementary school, timelines. And it wasn't until a lot later that I realized in part that's because of the biblical narrative, that it starts somewhere with God's creation. And for Christians, it's headed somewhere, namely the return of Christ. But whenever I talk about sacraments or liturgy, when I start to talk about that with students, I always show them an image of the Roman Catholic liturgical calendar. And if you want to Google it, it's Roman Catholic liturgical calendar, you'll see it's a wheel, right? Because the Christian year revolves every year around two big things: the birth and the death and resurrection of Jesus, Christmas and Easter. And so that kind of cyclical and linear movement is very comparable.
Yes. So from an Islamic perspective, time is created by God, regardless of scientific explanation of time, because there is a scientific explanation for time, how time is happening, what is time actually, scientifically. So regardless of that, time is a gift from God to human beings, and human beings are expected to use the time in a very productive way, like not spending time for nothing, not spending time for something that is not valuable. They should spend time on the things that are valuable, and that's something called consecrating of time. Like, for example, you do 5 daily prayers, the time that is there is becoming consecrated, like 24 hours. And also, when we say 24 hours, that shows that time is relative. Like time here on this planet is 24 hours, but maybe in another place is not 24 hours. Days are not 24 hours. That's why there's a verse in the Quran. It says, one day in the sight of God is 50,000 years. And that's why even we go to some kind of biblical and Quranic narratives that God created heavens and earth in 6 days. Muslim scholars are saying that that 6 days is not exactly 6 days of 24 hours that we have. 6 days could be 6 geological periods of time. So they elaborated on this time concept in a very detailed way. And coming to calendar, it is exactly the way that Noah explained in Islam, but not sync. There's no syncing in the Islamic calendar system. Lunar calendar is 10 days shorter than the Gregorian calendar, and therefore Ramadan is moving around the year. And there's like a beautiful explanation of it. They say 12 months ask God. It's not hadith, by the way, it's just like a good explanation. Hadith, for those who don't know, hadith is the saying of the Prophet, so it's not the saying of the Prophet. 12 months asked God, they said, Lord, you have created such a beautiful month of Ramadan, such a valuable, praiseworthy month of Ramadan, and it is just in 1 month. We like to have it in us too. So God said to them, I will make it returning to all of you. So all of you will have a shade from Ramadan. So basically, every 33 years, it comes to the same point. So for example, 33 years ago, Ramadan was in the, let's say, 10th of March, starting 10th of March. After 33 years, we'll come back to 10th of March again. And that's why sometimes you see some people, Muslims are fasting in summer, sometimes in winter. Well, because the time is based on lunar calendar and not Gregorian calendar.
And what makes Ramadan that special? Like all the 12 months want to have it.
Why is the
Yes.
specialty of Ramadan? I think the major aspect of Ramadan is known as the month of the Quran. The month that in which the Quran, the holy book of Islam, was revealed. And therefore, the Quran is a guidance for humanity. By the way, the Quran also says that Torah is guidance for humanity. There is light and guidance for humanity. The gospel is guidance for humanity. So in Islam, all these divine scriptures are divinely inspired, divinely revealed. And therefore, the Quran is known in the Islamic teaching as the final revelation of God. And that was revealed in the month of Ramadan.
Okay.
And that's why it's recommended that you recite a lot from the Quran. Muslims will come together and recite the Quran together. They had something called Khatm al-Quran. Even with Zoom, it becomes much more available. People are joining, from Indonesia to the same Zoom meeting. And then they have Khatm al-Quran together, reciting the Quran together. And that is what makes Ramadan more precious and Quranic month.
Thank you. When you said like time is a line, I almost heard it as time is a lie, and I was almost gonna believe it. But so these times, these sacred times, are basically points in some moment of history, like in the past, we sanctify the past. But what does it mean for us, like the present people, the modern people, especially considering the current times that we are going through, which is very difficult, hence the title of this event.
Yeah.
What does these sacred times teach you or inspire you as personally, and also you think as a general, like in your faith communities, how can people get inspired by a sanctified past to address the present and the future, the coming future? And I'll just leave it to any of you to take up that answer.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. I guess there's sort of two pieces that immediately spring to mind from the Haggadah, the book which is used at the Passover Seder, the first night of Passover, where Jewish families gather together to tell ritually the story of the Exodus. And one is a very famous statement that says, in every generation, each person is supposed to view themselves as if they themselves were liberated from Egypt. And it's really an important theological message that it's not supposed to be seen as a salvific act only in the past, but that sort of amazing salvific act in the past is supposed to be repeated in every generation and in every age. And I think that encourages Jewish people to see themselves as being worthy of God's power in the world. It's not just something that happened to our ancestors, it happens to us. And we relive it every year at the Seder by eating these particular foods that are supposed to remind us of being enslaved people and then eventually being free people. And the way that one behaves, you lie down at the Seder in an act of sort of free slouching and things like that. It was the one time a year I could tell my grandmother, like, look, I'm slouching and you can't tell me not to. So that's one thing, that the sort of carrying forward of this salvific act. The other thing, I think, is it's a call to justice. Again and again and again in the Hebrew Bible, God invokes the power of the Exodus to tell the Jewish people that you know what it's like to be oppressed. And because you know what it's like to be oppressed, therefore you know how oppressed people feel, and therefore you have a particular kind of responsibility to alleviate suffering in the world. I think that this is something that my people haven't always lived up to in its value. It's probably true of all of our traditions. That we have wonderful values that we don't always succeed in living up to, but I think Passover is a call to liberation, not just of us, but of everybody. So it's both a personal kind of liberation feeling that one's supposed to have and a call to action for others.
You know, what's so, I mean, what's so great about that, and just this kind of a thing, is that as I'm listening to you, I'm reminded of dynamics in my own tradition around in very different language and with very different meaning, moving in the same direction. So just when you're talking about Passover, I was, of course, thinking about, you know, the Christian narrative of Jesus celebrating the Passover meal, the final meal with his disciples, and that as the, you know, birth in many ways of the Eucharistic celebration. But we have this word in Christian theology, anamnesis, right, which sounds like amnesia, but it really means to call to mind, to remember. And it technically refers to a particular part of the Eucharistic prayer that's said every Sunday. So this is, in a way, it's sort of like the sacredness of every week.
Right.
But it refers to that particular prayer in the Eucharist where the priest prays, Father, calling to mind the death of your Son for our salvation, his glorious resurrection and ascension to heaven. But it has a broader meaning of this kind of calling to mind that's not just a remembering, but a remembering that makes present, right? So, and of course, in the Christian liturgy, that presence is Christ. Christ, you know, truly becomes present from a Catholic perspective, truly becomes present in the act of remembering that final meal that he had with his disciples. And of course, the point of Christ becoming present is not that we have the body of Christ in the Eucharistic elements, but that we consume these elements and become the body of Christ, which is another way of talking about, you know, a community that is concerned to act as Christ in the world. So anyway.
I also see connections in these symbolic foodstuffs, right? So much of the Passover Seder is about consuming foods to make you experience certain kinds of things. And clearly, the wine and the wafers in the Eucharist serve similar and parallel kinds of things, this kind of embodied practice.
Yeah. I was just telling my students that the Eucharist, the bread and wine, they always want to say it's not a symbol. And I said, no, it's not just a symbol. Right. But it does symbolize really powerful things. Yeah.
Right.
So basically, when we speak of the sacred time and what does mean for us, thinking of Ramadan as the most recent sacred time that we experienced just last month, it has several dimensions. One is related to experience of others, like putting yourself in the shoes of others. So, for example, you don't eat and drink for 14 hours. You really become very hungry, unbelievably hungry. I remember I asked one Muslim gentleman, what you feel like half an hour left for sunset, and there's like a dry piece of bread. He said, for me, it is more delicious than baklava. It's so delicious because you're so hungry. Now, Islam says, with this regard, actually, the Ramadan teaches Muslims that now you understand the situation of people who are involuntarily hungry. You are volunteering to be hungry because you are fasting and you have food to eat. But there are some people in the world that they don't have food to eat. And therefore, remember their situation. And when a person is telling you about those poor people, those who are really hungry people, you feel it because you say, oh, well, I experienced it. But imagine you are a very wealthy person and you have never experienced hunger, you will not feel it because you have never experienced it. So Islam, in this case, actually, making Muslims to be feeling this experientially and not in theory, basically. One aspect. Another aspect of the month of Ramadan is also known as the month of mercy. That is also in the Quran, like
mercy.
Mercy. every chapter of the Quran starts with two divine names, and that is the most compassionate, the most merciful. And Ramadan is the month of mercy. So basically, to receive the divine mercy, there is also a statement from the Prophet, be merciful to those on earth, the one in heaven will be merciful to you. So that makes really like considering other people. And of course, so when you say mercy, it's like a large concept. Mercy not only to human beings, but to animals, to nature, to the environment, is all included in this concept of mercy. Another aspect of Ramadan is the month of forgiveness. So forgive others so that you'll be forgiving. Exactly, that's what the Quran says. Don't you want to be forgiven? Then forgive others. Be forgiving person rather than taking for revenge, looking for revenge. Islam says forgiving is better. Is always forgiving is better. And that is how Ramadan will teach, basically.
And it also kind of is linked to the practice of Prophet Muhammad, who again lived in a particular time in history in 7th century. How does he inspire like the present Muslims in that sense?
Yes, it is.
Especially how he observed Ramadan.
Basically, the Quran says Prophet Muhammad is a model. So Muslims are following the path that he practiced. Like there is a story in the life of the Prophet, just to give an example of mercy. There is a wild camel, and no one is able to stop it. And when the camel sees the Prophet, and he comes closer to the Prophet. Actually, this is like mentioned in the major source of hadith, the collection of the Prophet sayings. And like extending its hand to the Prophet as if saying something. And the Prophet says, who is the owner of this camel? And a person in the crowd says, I am the owner. And he says, this camel told me that you have overloaded it and use it in very difficult things, and now you are trying to slaughter it. Is that true? And he says, yes, it is true. And then the Prophet says, you are not allowed to overload these animals. They are communities like you. They are servants of you, but you are not allowed to give more burden on them than they can bear. And therefore, like the mercy for all creation, not only for human beings. That is the practice of the Prophet is inspiring Muslims, supposed to inspire all Muslims. There will be some Muslims who will not be concerned about it, but there are Muslims who are really following the Prophet very, very accurately. And in Islam, it's not like something happened in the past. Time is not like one line, a direct line. It's like straight line. Time is circle. You can come actually to the same similar situation. Maybe one day there will be like so much peaceful environment as the time of the Prophet would witness. And actually, eventually in Islam, God is the creator of time, and all will be returning to God, regardless. Be good or bad, all people will be returning to God. The return of you, all human beings, the Quran says, is to God. So there will be no time in the afterlife. Time is worldly, in this worldly life, in the realm of creation, but the realm of eternity doesn't have time.
And a lot of those really sophisticated philosophical, theological questions about the nature of God, the nature of creation.
Yeah, there are many questions, theologies.
I was going to say, many of those questions were hammered out or worked through in medieval universities where Christian scholars like Thomas Aquinas were reading Jewish scholars, were reading Islamic scholars. So there's a long history of that kind of exchange.
Yes,
Yeah.
Yes, this is not the first time in human history that
Yes.
scholars of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have come
Don't
together to
you know-
talk about these things. This is not new.
Yeah, Maimonides,
Maimonides, indeed.
Musa bin Maimun in Arabic, he wrote in Arabic. He wrote his writings. in
Almost
Arabic.
everything,
Yes.
almost everything.
Yeah.
Thomas Aquinas refers to Al-Ghazali,
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's right.
the famous Muslim.
You're modeling, yeah.
We're modeling that.
Past. So it's almost like what you're telling is this time is we are building bridges, or these religions are building bridges between past and present and future by sanctifying particular times. And when we talk about building bridges, it speaks directly to what we are trying to do here at TUI Center for Interreligious Understanding. We usually see these sacred or religious holidays as opportunities for organizing interfaith events, like bringing people together around the iftar table or a Passover Seder, or we don't do much with like the mass like interfaith events, but we assume that these are the great times where people would be opening up their sacred to the others.
Mhm.
But we also know that these sacred times are actually consolidating why these communities are distinct from each other. Like it's tying each of them to a particular moment or experience that is not shared by others.
Yeah.
So you, as scholars and practitioners of these, Abrahamic faiths, how do you see your vision of interfaith dialogue? Like, what are we trying to achieve in this paradox of like differences and similarities?
I had a very powerful experience recently on these lines. About 2 weeks ago, just over 2 weeks ago, in the Jewish tradition was a fast day, the fast of Esther, which coincided with Ramadan. And the Muslim community was having a big community-wide iftar dinner where Muslims would break the fast, first pray together and then break the fast together. And I was thinking, because I was fasting as well, oh, I'll go with my Muslim colleagues and my students to the iftar dinner. Certainly at a time of war in Israel and Gaza, and a time when many Jews and Muslims are sort of taught that they're supposed to be enemies in certain ways, it was really important for me to go and say the opposite, right? And I said this explicitly to the imam who was present there and said, people keep telling me that we're supposed to be enemies. I refuse to be enemies. And he said, absolutely, I refuse to be enemies. And as the Muslims went into another room to pray, it was precisely the same time for Jewish prayer. And so I was able to stand in a room of maybe, I don't know, 150 Muslims praying and to pray my Jewish prayer. It wasn't that we were doing the same thing. Each of us were doing our own traditions, but doing it together simultaneously was something that I found, certainly I found deeply meaningful in that kind of way. On the other hand, the Passover Seder, which in some ways is supposed to reflect an ancient temple-based meal in which the Passover lamb was consumed. The Bible is very clear that only Israelites are supposed to join in this meal. And so I think that maybe the Passover Seder is not the ideal time within the Jewish liturgical year to invite outsiders. It really is an inward-looking time, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other times, especially the holiday of Sukkot, the festival of booths, in the fall, which really is much more about inviting others in. And this sort of ebbing and flowing, I think, is part of what sacred time gives us, that there may be times where we're supposed to be more focused in the world. There may be other times when we're supposed to be more focused internally, and that's a delicate balance. And I'm not quite sure exactly when to emphasize one over the other.
Yeah, no, I really like the question, because it's getting at the heart of kind of, if the point of all of this were for everyone to be the same, how awful that would be. I mean, in other words, if the differences or the sense of identity in each religious community, I sometimes tell my students, because I think that their knee-jerk reaction is, well, first of all, they don't know much about anything else or even their own tradition. But once we are talking about introducing them to other religious traditions or even other Christian traditions, it's a good instinct. They see the similarities. They want to talk about similarities and commonalities. And I think that's way better than holding biases or prejudices against others. So that's great. But if we stop there, we're all basically the same. I kind of challenge them because I think that sometimes when we say that, what we're saying is, oh, you're a lot more like me than I thought. And you're not really listening to the other person. So it's a challenge to like really listen to the other person and, let them say what they say and what they mean, So, as you were talking, I couldn't help but think of like the Celebrate the Spirit Mass at John Carroll at the start of every academic year. Jesuit universities do this around the world. And you two have been so generous since you've been here, I think just about every time in offering one of the prayers of the faithful in in the Hebrew or in Arabic. And it's a beautiful sort of moment. But I think the Eucharist is another one of those times for Catholics that are that where that tension is held, right? Because I go to a Catholic church, where every week on the bulletin it says all are welcome. And all are welcome, but it's not an open communion situation. Like we ask that those who are not Catholic, come for a blessing, but not receive. So, and that seems like that's got it. On the one hand, it seems very inhospitable, but on the other hand, it's saying something kind of about the sacredness of this religious identity, this tradition that we.
Zeki and I had a funny moment. I don't know if you remember this at the Mass of the Spirit a few years ago, where we were part of the procession at the very beginning, and in some ways we're following somebody holding the cross, holding the big crucifix. And when they were telling us what to do, right, that cross stays at the front, and whoever was, I think it was Mo, was telling us, okay, now you'll bow. And Zeki and I looked at each other and we say, no, we're not going to bow, right? We're not going to bow to Jesus, right? And she said, oh, right. And so, but it was this very interesting moment where we were sort of, on the one hand, deeply invested in participating and being part of the community, and also wishing to sort of maintain our own religious boundaries and not do particular behaviors that might sort of violate our own truth claims. And obviously this is a community where that was humorous as opposed to offensive. And yet it does sort of put the finger on some of these places where there are lines, where
There are lines,
can't cross them.
Yeah, like for example, in Islam, you can sit and you can listen, but you are not allowed to drink alcohol.
Right.
If the bread that you like put in wine, it becomes not allowed for Muslims, like religiously speaking. So there are some boundaries, basically. But the point I like to make actually with this regard is coming from a Quranic verse, the verse clearly says, "O people of the book," and asking the Prophet of Islam, say, "O people of the book." People of the book is a terminology in the Quran, is a term used for Christians and Jews. They are known as the people of the book. The reason for that, they believe in the books that are revealed by God, and that is the gospel of Jesus and the Torah of Moses. God's revealed the Torah to Moses. God revealed the gospel to Jesus according to the Islamic teaching. God revealed to Psalms to David. So these are very, very important divine books. And therefore, the people who are following these are not the people of the book, and they have very important place in the Islamic teaching. So this verse asks the Prophet to invite the people of the book to a common ground. It says actually common word. O Prophet, tell to the people of the book, let's come to a common word. And that is, to worship only one God. Let's come to a common word, and that is to worship only one God. So like it's showing a great umbrella that we come together worshiping one God. This is like the largest umbrella that Muslims, Christians, and Jews can come together. So in my book, I hope it's not promotion of my book, Islam's Jesus, the Jesus of Islam, Islam's Jesus basically. I argue that this coming together is a big issue and very important issue. Not really like a thing that is just can be abandoned. It is about the world, the peace in the world. If Muslims, Christians, and Jews are coming together, the people of the book, these people who are following the Quran, following the Torah, and following the gospel, if they come together, like a rough calculation of these three religious traditions, the followers of these three religious traditions are making 58% of world population, more than half of humanity. And they have so much common ground, they can make a big change in the world. And I think they should come together, and they will come together. Eventually, they will come together. There are some narratives in the Islamic teaching that eventually they will understand each other, they will come together to a common ground, and then work for the betterment of humanity.
And I agree 100%. That
Thank you.
would be a better place, right, if we come together. And I think that those commonalities, the belief in the one God, the moral code, and so on, are so essential and important. And in one way, these three Abrahamic religions, which each trace their ancestry and their tradition back to the prophet, the patriarch Abraham. In one ways, it makes it, there is this kind of commonality. At the same time, it makes it challenging because, the Quran praises the Gospels and the Torah and the Psalms, but also the understanding is there are mistakes in the Gospel and that we have. So I guess what I'm saying is that in a way, it makes the challenge of listening and dialogue difficult, because Christianity draws from the Hebrew scriptures and reinterprets those scriptures. The Quran draws from the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures and reinterprets those. So even though we have these commonalities, which is the place to start, there are also the conversations are not always easy, because you hold things that are very dear to me, and we disagree on things that are very important.
One thing about the last statement that you
And that's
mentioned.
okay. Right?
I totally understand that, and that's very beautiful.
Yeah.
The Quran refers to the Torah and the Gospel, the Psalms. One thing, there is no mistake in the Torah. There is no mistake in the Gospel. There is no mistake in the Psalms, because they are revealed by God. The mistake is through translations. So that's what Muslim scholars will say, because God doesn't change his mind. God just sent the message according to the situation of the time. And therefore the mistake, like for example, for the Quran, Muslims will not call the translation of the Quran as the Quran. They will say the translation of the Quran. So they will not call the translation of the Torah as the Torah. English translation is not the Torah. The real original language, English Bible is English, the gospel is not the gospel. The original, the Aramaic gospel will be the gospel.
Well, that's helpful.
So that's how Muslims are.
No, and I appreciate the clarification. I think that's helpful, because that does point to a deeper unity.
Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, this is just one example of how things are going in our department. Any random conversation into a deep dive into, theologies, and we can keep talking and talking, but I think our time is up for our conversation. We have some questions from the audience. Okay. The notion of time is interesting, given the quickening that has seemed to occur, and now even the linear nature of time and place. All religions have a scale and interpretation of time and space. Is the saying in English, time heals all wounds, universal across the major religions of the world and planet Earth? That's a very great question.
That's a good question.
Very good question.
Time heals all wounds. Is that a universal thing across the major religions of the world?
Well, there's, if
Can I say like something about
Please,
that?
please.
Yes, time heals in a sense that things that are happening, maybe you are becoming angry, you are becoming very much strongly opposing something, and that could really lead to some negative things if you don't control yourself. So time heals in a sense that when there is a suffering, when there is a difficulty, you are expected to be patient. The Quran says God is with the patient people. Patience. When you are patient, like in one occasion, there is a saying of the Prophet, excuse me, the Prophet asks to his community, who is the hero in your idea, in your opinion? And they say, we believe that the one who defeats his rival in wrestling, he is the hero. And the Prophet says, no. The one who is swallowing his anger when he is angry, that is the hero. That is the hero. That's the hero person. So in this case, time heals. So that person at that moment did some mistakes. Don't immediately respond. Leave it for the time. Maybe he will change his mind even. Maybe it will be some changes, and then eventually you're not having that difficulties that probably you would have initial reaction. And therefore, patience is a big value in the Islamic teaching. It says religion is like half of religion is patience.
Very interesting. I don't know, I'm gonna be contrarian. I'm not sure that the Jewish view is that time heals all wounds. I think the Jewish view is in a sense that human beings have been empowered to heal their own wounds. And so it's not a passive allowing things to get better. It's more of a challenge to heal wounds. In some sense, this too is a kind of imitatio Dei kind of thing of God heals, and therefore human beings should imitate God and heal. But also this notion, and here it's somewhat different, I think, from Christian theological ideas too, God isn't so immanent in the Jewish tradition. God is a little bit more distant, and the way that one interacts with God is through the Torah and through the commandments, and trying to enact moral communities. And I'm not sure that sort of time heals all wounds. The humans have the tools to heal wounds, and if only we were to again live up to our values and use the divinely transmitted content, it's up to us to sort of fix things in the world we live in.
What I love about the question, is that it takes a cliche,
Right.
and really pushes it deep. I was hearing that in the talking about the acceleration of the condensation of time or something, and so I would just add as a Christian that it depends, right? I mean, if we're looking at it, in the short term, the imminent term, in the term of all of our lives, I would have to say, there's a lot of wounds that are not healed by time. And there are certainly those wounds that are healed in time. But from a Christian perspective, if we take the long view, the kind of the eschatological view, I would say, again, another cliche, but I would say the kind of deep Christian hope is that that everything will be all right in the end, right? Because if it's not all right, it's not the end.
Right.
So maybe that is the meaning of time heals. Everything will be all right at the end. I think that makes I think that makes sense in the Islamic teaching. And I understand Noah's point. Yes, from an Islamic perspective, also you have to do what you can do.
Yeah.
You have to do what you can do, but do not be hopeless. Okay, I couldn't do anything, then everything is gone. Everything is hopelessness. No. There will be actually a healing for it, because in Islam, there is life after this life. Let's say something didn't heal in this world, but the afterlife is healing everything. Afterlife is like so much justice is applied, even if there is an injustice among animals, the animals that we did injustice to another animal will be the right of that animal will be taken from the oppressor one.
The lion will lay next to the lamb, is that what you're saying?
That is what is mentioned. So basically, that's how the eschatological tradition is saying.
Yeah.
So for example, let's say a criminal person who killed maybe thousands of people and he died, he committed suicide, he didn't go to jail, he didn't do anything. So this person will never be punished? No, in the Islamic teaching, it says he will be punished in the afterlife. He is not actually escaping the divine justice.
Yeah.
The divine justice will be applied. So time healing maybe because it's so much dominant concept, I don't want to say it's not accurate because so much there's like consensus on it. But I think it is true that eventually things will be all right. Eventually, if not in this world, it will be in the afterlife. Because everything is under the control of God.
I think, yeah, in that sense, not time, but either human or God heals. And in many cases, it's kind of not really separated from each other. It's kind of two faces of the same. We have another question. What have faith leaders traditionally in each of your religious traditions said about trying times? What have they said as it pertains to perseverance? You've mentioned patience, perseverance a lot, right? So in your traditions, trying times, how is it?
The time of trial, you mean? The time of
trying times, difficult
Do you have
times.
anything to say about trying times? Sure. Yeah.
That's chronologically.
Oh, well, here it's not chronologically. I went originally, my mind went originally to a famous Talmudic section in which there's this notion of what's called the Yisurin Shel Ahava, afflictions of love, which is a sort of difficult theological notion in which trying times are actually seen as evidence of God's presence. And that somehow suffering or difficult times are to be interpreted as signs of God's love, whether this is sort of a testing kind of notion for an afterlife kind of reward, or just a sort of core notion that part of what it is to be a human being is to suffer. Right? This seems to be built into the human condition. And maybe the goal is not to run away from that, but to sort of, as the kids say today, to lean into that as a way of trying to experience the divine even through times that are difficult. Also, I think that in this long arc of time, the Jewish tradition, certainly the rabbinic tradition, sees these sort of the Bible talks about a first exile and a return after the destruction of the first temple in 586 BC, and 70 years later, a return to rebuild the temple. Well, there is now a second exile. And the temple was destroyed again in 70 at the hands of the Romans, and Jews experienced the contemporary moment as a second exile, with all of the concomitant, sufferings that entails. But this notion that just as the first exile ended with redemption and with the rebuilding of the temple, that so too the second exile will end in the same way. I think that gives the kind of hope that the suffering isn't for.
I can't quote a pope, but the words of Sister Mary Edward from my elementary school come to mind, which was "offer it up," which in a certain sense is very kind of sort of Catholic attitude, and in many ways for Christians, for Catholics, it comes back to Jesus. And I think that a very traditional and very powerful way of talking about that times of trying times and suffering times is to see in Jesus's own suffering, right? A God who understands and who is with you in your suffering, and in some way that's very hard to say to somebody who's suffering, and you can only really experience it in your own suffering as a Christian, to find some comfort or solace in that identification with the suffering of Jesus. It's another good question.
One thing I'd like to add, maybe, life in Islam is a test. Life is a test. So when there is suffering, there is a purpose there. And human beings could find the purpose for that. Could be because there is a verse in the Quran, whatever evil comes to you, it's from your own soul. Whatever good comes to you is from God. So maybe God gives human beings some bounties and they don't appreciate. God says, I'm taking back. I gave you, you didn't get it. So I am taking it back. So that could be one kind of test for humanity. But when you have that patience, you'll be rewarded for that. There is this concept, like I remember when I was at Berry College in Rome, I met a Muslim who was in his 50s, and he told me that he lost his taste ability. So he was eating, he told me, eating baklava and meat doesn't make difference for him. It's so like the same. And he went to his doctor said, I'm now thinking that you are saying, why me? And this believer, Muslim, he said, no, actually, I'm saying, no, why not me? Because God gave me this sense of taste for 50 years. Did I thank to God for this? Now, for a few years, he's taking back. So basically, that's the idea. We have given many bounties. And therefore, if some suffering happens, human beings are not supposed to be just reaction against God. God, why you are doing this to me? No. To be patient, God, you have a purpose. I know when this purpose is fulfilled, you will give it back to me.
Can I just return?
Yes, please.
Something, I promise I'll shut up. But from the very first comment that you made this evening had to do with, how you use time. And I've been thinking since you said that of a homily, a wise priest years ago gave that I hadn't thought of in a long time until this conversation. And he was talking about how he had spent a Christmas vacation with his extended family at this beach house. And it was multi-generational, he's the uncle and there'd be all these kids of different ages and so on and so forth. And he said, I noticed something during the week that I was with all these wonderful people. He said the children, the young ones, were very jealous of their stuff. They didn't want to share it. They just were protective of it. He said the teenagers were very jealous of their space, which is hard when you're all kind of living together. He said the adults were very jealous of their time. And I just was thinking about how are we using our time? How are we sharing our time? Anyway, very interesting. I don't know that I can make anything profound theologically from that, but this has been a good time. A good time.
Yeah, and that concludes our discussion. And I think this was a good time, well spent.
Yeah.
We thank Rory for the opportunity to have this conversation and, in the presence of wonderful people who are watching and listening to us. And that's all from us.
Thank you.
That's all for now. You all will be back in a major force here on John Carroll's campus. Semiha, thank you so much for a wonderful discussion, and to our three panelists, Ed, Noah, and Zeki, thank you so much. Thank you all for tuning in. I'm just going to leave you all with a quote here. Interreligious dialogue is a shared path to peace, and on behalf of peace, as such, it is necessary and irrevocable. Interreligious dialogue is an urgently needed and incomparable service to humanity, which gives praise and glory to the Creator of all. This is from Pope Francis. So thank you all for honoring him in the spirit of that this evening. So thank you all for coming, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.